To unpack what this means for business, we've put together a panel of local and international business leaders to talk through how their organisations are handling the impact of COVID-19 and their views on the economic recovery. I'd now like to hand over to Bloomberg's own Haidi Stroud-Watts, who will moderate this session.
Ed, thank you. Without further ado, I'd like to bring in our panellists today, Mark van Dyck, who's the Asia Pacific Regional Managing Director of Compass Group. We're also joined by John Meacock, who's the Deloitte Chief Strategy Officer with us, and Belinda Hutchinson, Chancellor of the University of Sydney. Thank you all for making time and being with us to have this unusual but certainly crucial conversation. John, I might start off with you. The big question, what does the post-pandemic world, the new normal, look like as we have all these economies in the US, where I know you're based now, there's increasing talk about what the roadmap back to, an economic normalization even looks like. What's your best case scenario or best guess at what that world and what the Australian economy looks like?
Heidi, look, it's obviously a challenging time. I'm not sure it's my best case, but I think we're looking at it saying, most developed countries will go through a decline in GDP somewhere between -3% to -10%. We expect Australia's probably in that -4% to 5% area. I mean, there's a lot of chat around, is it a V shape, U shape, L shape? I mean, I think our view is that all economies are going to be slow to recover until really this virus gets defeated. So that, that's a real challenge. And I think, as we heard before, it's interesting as you see the various countries in terms of timing. We've been using FIFO, which, first in, first out. Those countries that have gone into sort of recession first are the ones coming out. So clearly we're seeing Asia coming out first, then Europe, then the Americas. But as Wendy said before, and that previous thing, the concern is we haven't even got to some of those third world countries, developing countries like Africa. So I think that's where we're seeing. I think from an Australia perspective, the Australian economy has that advantage of being close to Asia, so that is a real advantage. But we are in a very different world. We're in a different world because normally reserve banks or central banks have that ability to influence. Here they have much less ability to influence. We've got interest rates at zero. They haven't really recovered since the global financial crisis, so our ability for Reserve Bank to make a big difference is probably limited. And I think the Reserve Bank governor said it. He danced around the issue a bit last week, but we are set for high unemployment for a while, probably not seeing unemployment drop below the sort of 6% until 2023. So I don't think we should be expecting to rush out of this. But China and Asia is our big chance. And I think, where we will see business is, some significant shifts. Some of it just speeding up things we were seeing before, increasing things of automation, artificial intelligence. We think we are going to have that increasing focus on things, some of the societal impacts like climate change. So a lot of those will just be moved forward, more rapidly on the pace they're at. But we will see big shifts. And, again, they were touched on a bit before, things like, increased resilience, countries and companies wanting to improve their resilience, probably less efficiency, more on resilience than what we've seen before, and see a lot of change in a lot of industries. But, again, if we can defeat the crisis, defeat the virus, then, life will go back to normal for a lot of areas as well, but certainly significant shifts in business and industry.
Belinda, I'm wondering, in terms of your conversations with students, with university graduates, you don't envy this next generation of grads that are heading out into a world that's basically certain to see severe recession, if not depression. But at the same time, I think, as John sort of alluded to, these dislocations can give rise to opportunity and innovation, right? Is there conversation being had about how when we return to normal, it's going to be a new and in some respects a better type of normal?
I think it's a really good question, Heidi, and it's really interesting what the universities in Australia have been able to achieve. I've been incredibly impressed that our staff have been able to get 96% of our units of study online in under 5 weeks, so that we have all of our students, both international and domestic, now working remotely. And I think that just shows a lot about the capacity of universities to be innovative and responding to challenges. And it's interesting, the feedback from students is really positive. Yes, they want to get back on campus, but they are actually achieving the sort of education that they wanted to achieve. And I've been really impressed by that. It's, I think, an opportunity for us looking forward to what does that mean. So with that digitisation capacity, with that capacity to learn online, that's not what our students want to do, but I think we can take the very best of that learning that we're now doing online and apply that back on campus and in other ways. So I think that is one of the positives coming out of this. You know, the university sector in Australia is such a significant part of our economy today. You know, over the last 30 years, we've seen an enormous growth in diversification of income for our universities. So, for example, now the University of Sydney only receives 30% of its income from the government. The rest of it comes largely from international students, but also from engagement within industry, partnerships on research, and also from philanthropy, which has been very important. So, you know, we've become a very significant part of this economy, contributing about $150 billion per year, and in terms of indirect and direct employment, around 250,000 Australians are employed by the sector. So I think when you look at our agenda in terms of research, and that's what our international students help to contribute to, we wouldn't be able to do the world-leading research we do. If you look at the sort of research that we're doing, and we've done a lot on the pandemic recovery, how do we come out of this? We've done a lot on infectious diseases control. We've been working in terms of detection with the New South Wales and federal governments on detection of the health issues relating to COVID-19. I think that the sector has a huge capacity to really make a contribution going forward, and I think it's actually exciting in a very, very difficult time.
Mark, I want to bring you into the conversation. We spoke actually just sort of a week or so ago, and I know you're in a task force that's looking at how to capitalise on access to the Chinese market as you see the economic recovery take place in China. I'm wondering, though, are you optimistic about how much Australia can benefit, given that a Chinese recovery in its own vacuum is not going to be as impactful when you consider that the slowdown will most likely continue outside of its borders?
I think that's a great question, Heidi. I mean, let me say a couple of things first. I mean, I'm enormously optimistic about our potential to diversify and Australia's potential role within the region. One thing I do want to say is I think we have to be an open economy. And one of the things that worries me a little bit at the moment is these sort of calls that we should reduce trade with China. I think they're misguided, and I also don't think that's how trade works. You know, China is really important to us. It's our number one export market, largest source of international students, Belinda's business, and our most valuable tourism market. 30% of our 470 billion trade goes there. So to suggest that we, reduce trade with China just basically means that we will reduce the standard of living for Australians and diminish our ability to bounce back. I think we've got to build trade with China, and then I think we've got to build on the existing relationships that we've got in the region. Japan's a long-standing relationship. Indonesia is a great opportunity, top 5 economy by 2030. Korea, similar to Japan and India, the fastest growing economy globally. I mean, I think in terms of Australia's trade at the moment, we're predominantly a sort of agriculture and commodities play. And quite a few studies, and we endorse this obviously at the task force that I lead. John's firm did it. The BCA did a comparative advantage study. We have potential in advanced manufacturing, life sciences, biotech, food and beverage, all of which will be given, I think, somewhat of an impetus in the recovery from COVID. I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to diversify trade, and I think also governments have already helped in Australia. We have strong free trade agreements, some of the best trade negotiators in the world, and already some example companies that have built significant trade. So I'm quite optimistic about it.
Belinda, it goes pretty much without saying how highly geared the tertiary education industry in Australia is to foreign students. And we saw that was really one of the earlier sectors to be hit by these travel restrictions and flight lockdowns. Do you see a recovery? And I should bring up the fact that we do have an audience question from Trevor Rowe of Rothschild Australia asking, will foreign students attending Australian universities be seeing a permanent downturn when it comes to numbers?
It'll be very interesting to see, and I guess it really does depend largely on when we see the ban on international travel lifting. As you mentioned, we were one of the first sectors really confronted with the coronavirus because of that ban on international travel. But it was interesting, we already had a number of our students that had arrived, and we had a number of our students arrive by third countries. So our numbers are down in terms of international students by around 18% this semester. We're yet to see what happens going into semester 2, but you would expect that to be worse because you won't have the commencing students coming in. So overall, we've got an export industry that's worth around $38 billion. I think it's a huge success story. We've done extremely well as compared to other countries. We're seen as a very high quality higher education sector. We rank very significantly in the top 100 universities in the world. And, all in all, I think it's been a great success story. Yes, we are exposed because of the international travel ban, but it's quite interesting. Our students, as I mentioned earlier, both international and domestic, are working online and seem to be engaging well in that they want to come back. And in fact, our applications are looking good for next year. So I think we will have a downturn and it will impact us. I mean, the flow-on effects to the economy, I think, are quite significant. I don't think people quite understand that. We've just had some external modelling done for our university just with the deferral of international students that we've had to date, and for this year, we reckon that the impact on the New South Wales gross state product will be around $2.2 billion and impact about 15,000 jobs. Now, we've got 40 universities. Not all of those are going to have the same level of multiplier, but probably you do 20 times on that. So we do need to rebuild this capacity. Will it be the same? Probably not. We've already done a lot in terms of diversification of our students. We get a large number of students from the US, from Canada, Europe. We've also been diversifying into India, into Southeast Asia. I think students today, both our students in Australia and internationally, want to travel. We have 35% of our domestic students looking to have overseas university experience during their time with us. I don't think that's going to change, but has it slowed down? Yes, very significantly. Have we got significant financial issues as a result? Yes. But I think we'll see a turnaround. It'll take time to grow back. I agree with Mark's comments.
I want to take this chance to bring up one of 3 poll questions that we have today. And this is, interestingly, a question that we also put to our audiences last year and in 2018 as well, with very different responses. If we can pull that up, it asks, China's influence is rapidly growing in Southeast Asia, in the South Pacific, in the South China Sea, through soft and hard power, aid, investment and military presence. What should Australia do? Should we A, push back and assert our position, or B, accept China's rising power and try to work with it? In 2018, 90% of respondents in Sydney said we should accept China's power overwhelmingly. Last year, we had a fairly even split. In Melbourne, about half said push back. In Sydney, more than 70% still said to accept China's power. So we'll let the audience respond and we'll bring up the results as we get to them. But John, I want to go back to you in terms of this idea of trade diversification, not just in terms of industries, but in terms of trade partners. Australia's fortunes over the past 30 years have favourably been tied to the coattails of the great rise of China, right? But even just recently, the most recent example of the Chinese ambassador to Australia, not directly threatening, but certainly suggesting that perhaps Chinese consumers might boycott Australian products. Maybe they just won't consume Australian beef or drink Australian wine because of our Prime Minister's support for an investigation into the handling of the coronavirus. Does this suggest to you not just this sort of, turning point, but the fact that we've had many years of uncomfortable tensions with Beijing, that industries, companies, policy needs to work harder at diversification?
Look, I'm a bit with Mark on this. I mean, we're in some ways in a very fortunate position because if you have a look at, there's very few countries that got in front of this virus, but the ones that have are China, Hong Kong, South Korea, the ones that we will trade with in Asia and are incredibly important trading partners for us. And you look at China, I mean, China is emerging faster than most others and emerging faster without the same level of stimulus that a number of other countries are going to have to put in place. So, I'm really concerned if we do take our focus away from working with China. I think China is a big opportunity. There was mention before about some of the destruction of things like WTO and World Health Organization and United Nations, which the current US administration has in some ways been doing. China may well step up into some of those in terms of helping support the developing countries as well. So clearly we would need to make sure we've got enough diversification for resilience, but I would be very concerned if we back away from China and don't see China as an opportunity still, given the fact that they're out of this first, they're going to be growing quicker than others, and are going to be still our most important trading partner.
Mark, is that your view as well, that we double down in terms of building those relationships, and does that happen more on a company-to-company level?
Yeah, I'm with John on this, Heidi. I think we have to continue to focus on China. I think we have to separate the kind of diplomatic and virus concern from the trading relationship and dialogue. I think that the thing we have to look at, I mean, example is our business. We're back operating almost at full level versus prior to COVID. So it shows you the speed of recovery that we might see in China for those businesses that are already there. I think the thing we have to do is look at middle classes. I think the opportunity for Australia is in the sectors we talked about before, and that's predominantly about us targeting a middle class consumer. And there's 400 million of them in China. And even a niche of that market is an extremely valuable business. I mean, ask A2 Milk. So I think that's one of the reasons that we have to really look carefully at preserving and growing that relationship, whilst also at the same time working to build our trade in the rest of Asia, because inevitably the opportunity will be there. And I think some of the sectors, as I said before, that we could face into that allow us to diversify our trade will be given a bit of a shot in the arm. I mean, a great example is the sector I'm in, take food. I mean, even before COVID-19, Asian consumers, particularly Chinese, were passionate about clean, green, quality food. We can do that. We probably can't be the food bowl to Asia because the numbers don't work. We could at best produce about the equivalent of 130 million populations worth of food. There's 4.5 billion in the region. We want to be the delicatessen, high-end quality food, and take a leaf out of the New Zealand book. New Zealand has done that really well. They're now the largest exporter of food to China. Government made a very intentional strategy behind it. Businesses focused on it. They have a strong brand. I think that's absolutely something that we can do as well.
Belinda, is diversification when it comes to looking to appeal beyond the Chinese tertiary students something that the university is focusing on?
Yeah, and we have been doing that, Heidi, over the last few years. I mean, we've seen this as one of our highest risks, international student concentration. So we've obviously been doing a lot of work on this. And as I mentioned, US, Canada and Europe have been key sources of students for us. And again, other Asian countries, again, very important for us. And we will continue to do that. And it works both ways. We send our students to them, they send their students back to us. So it will continue to grow, and I think we'll absolutely be focused on diversification going forward. But it does take time. I mean, the fact is the Chinese students really understand the quality of Australian higher education. We're in the same time zone. We're seen as a safer, a place to come, strong economy. People talk about the students wanting to come here because they want to get a visa to live here. I can tell you our students go back to China and are very, very successful in terms of their careers there. But there are those that from maybe from other universities that do seek to get permanent residency, but it's certainly not a driver for us. They want to come and get a great education. They get great jobs. When I travel throughout Asia and I meet our alumni, it's very impressive to see the roles that they have with multinational corporations, with their own state-owned corporations, with their own businesses in their countries, and they're very entrepreneurial. They look to set up their own businesses. So I see it as a good success story, and I think it's actually really important for us. I think it's important for all of our students to engage with a diverse student population. I think it's important for cultural competency, and universities today work collaboratively internationally. That's absolutely key to what we do. So a lot of our research is done jointly. So if you look at the coronavirus and the mapping of the genome, one of our researchers, Professor Eddie Holmes, was working with universities in Europe, the US, and in China to do that mapping. We've had other of our professors working with other universities around the world in terms of pandemic responses. And there's just all of the work we do is very much done on the basis of international partnerships. So I see that trade diversification being absolutely critical going forward, although I think there has to be a balance about what we need to be able to produce in our own country. And there's been some good examples of that, and I could talk more down the track on that.
Yeah, that's actually what we'll talk about next. A really good point. But before we leave the results of that last poll, I want to bring them up and see how our audience and our listeners fairly evenly split there in terms of 47% saying that we should push back and assert our position against China's growing dominance in the Asia-Pacific region, and the rest saying that we accept and try to work with it. All right, I actually want to bring up the next poll and then discuss that with our panelists. This is to do with this idea of greater domestic economic sovereignty, which is something that the Prime Minister from very early on in this crisis has alluded to without details as to how this is really achieved. But it really kind of calls into question how you go about getting this new push for greater domestic economic sovereignty. Is it achieved through populist measures? Is it achieved through government investment in strategic companies, creating government stockpiles of essential items? Do they include toilet paper, for example? But encouraging more trade and diversification, which we've just covered, encouraging more domestic manufacturing, so bringing manufacturing back to home, all of the above, none of the above. And in fact, one of our viewers at the moment, Jackson Barton from the University of Queensland, questioning how do you prevent the populist reversion argument to come back into this debate. So we'll wait for those responses in just a couple of minutes. But John, is this a necessary conversation that we need to be having at the moment? There's still a lot of debate as to whether the shortages, of everything from PPE to, household products is a supply issue or a logistics issue, right? Do you think Australia needs to put in place different policies to be able to address this for the next crisis?
Look, I think governments have realised that they probably didn't have the right insurance, and by that I mean not commercial insurance, but insurance in terms of resilience to shocks. So that'd be, critical healthcare or critical manufacturing capability to create. So I think there is an element of need for social safety nets, need for certain critical aspects, be it manufacturing capacity, to do some of the health equipment and some of those sort of things, that I think even in and I'm very much around, open economies, etc. But I think there will be a reason to actually invest more in those in case of future pandemics. Now, I don't think it's this big nationalist view. It's really around just that sort of insurance, if you like, to say that we are prepared and we can actually manufacture or provide certain activities in a crisis. And you've seen recently Australia, albeit not a huge amount of money, but even talk about buying more strategic oil reserves to enable us to be prepared. So I think if you look at it as a certain element of insurance, I think it does make sense.
Mark, do you think the sovereignty issue comes into the restrictions that we've seen, further restrictions when it comes to seeing foreign direct investment at the start of this pandemic crisis period. Do you think that's the right way to go about things, or is this a time where we should actually be considering allowing more foreign capital?
Look, Heidi, I think foreign direct investment is a critical part of economic growth. I think in Australia, to get the sort of growth levels we're going to need going forward, we're going to need to be able to build international trade. I don't think we can be reliant entirely upon a domestic economy. Our economy is not big enough. And so we have to become a strong kind of trading nation. I think this crisis gives an opportunity to do a big reset. And I think government has already responded well to that. I think some of the things for us to think about, clearly we need to build some level of security that we've got the right supply chains, the right suppliers of essentials. But I think some of the other things for us to think about is we've got the right skills framework for the future. Are we able to, digitize as well as we need to do to be competitive? Could we be partnering more with universities for a greater innovation agenda in Australia? These are some of the questions I think that we have an opportunity to ask ourselves. And I think certainly in our business, what we've found is this has been an unbelievable pressure test, like the likes of which you never have, you hope to often in your life. And it tells you what works and what doesn't work. And I think the same is true of an economy. I think the important thing is to come out of this and go, well, if we don't still need to do it and it gets in the way, like some of the things that really reduce the productivity that we have in Australia and our ability to compete. We need an overhaul of some of the industrial relations frameworks, for example. Then why do we still do them? Let's fix them and set ourselves up for a better path of economic growth coming out of this, because the opportunities will be there, particularly in Asia.
And in fact, Mark, the IMF in its forecast saying that Asia is actually going to be the only region in the world with any sort of positive growth in 2020, albeit of just 1%. And we know that Asia, both in terms of being ahead when it comes to its path in this virus trajectory, but also in the economic robustness and potential for growth, is likely to lead the global recovery. So, my question, I suppose, Belinda, I might get you to respond to this. Are we taking full advantage of the growth opportunities that we see in Asia? And, how do we kind of go beyond mining and agriculture, digging stuff out of the ground, shipping things overseas, but increasingly so, higher education has become almost a traditional pillar industry. Beyond that, what can we potentially, leverage for the future?
I think Mark started to focus on that in terms of advanced manufacturing. I think there's real opportunities for us there. And just going back to the previous question, I think one of the things that I'm excited about is the National COVID-19 Coordination Commission that the government set up. And I think with Nev Power, ex-CEO of Fortescue, and David Thodey, ex-CEO of Telstra, we've got a great opportunity to look at advanced manufacturing opportunities for this country. And I think there's a bit of an underestimation of what capacity we already have. I mean, I'm chairman of a company called Thales, which employs 4,000 people around Australia, and we do a lot in terms of defence, government, systems engineering, and things like that. We have 400 software engineers employed in Melbourne, developing air traffic control systems for Australia and for Asia for export. We developed sonars, which we did together with universities, and specific technology, which has been very well regarded not only by the Australian Navy, but also we sell into Europe, into France and into the UK. So I think there's some really good success stories that people don't know about. We hear about the ResMeds, the CSLs, the Cochlears and all of those. But I think there's a lot more going on that people don't know about. And I think Mark's spot on. I think we really need to focus on research and development and innovation and partnerships between the universities and business. And I've got some fantastic examples that I see every day, and every university I speak to has the same sort of examples. With Rio Tinto, we've developed a lot of their robotics for automated minings. And then with Qantas, we've developed flight optimization and fuel cost efficiency programs, which are saving them tens of millions of dollars a year. and the list goes on. I can go on about that, but some of the research I think we're doing at the moment around AI, around digitization, about using cloud computing, around 3D printing, and with additive manufacturing, with a whole range of industry players, this could set up Australia for serious success in the future. And there's a lot of opportunities in many areas of engineering and science, medical and health, technologies. We have some absolutely world-leading capacity, and we have some great companies and great universities to do that work. So, again, R&D incentives, I think, will be really important. R&D tax credits, I think, would be great to get back on the table. So there's a lot of things we can do going forward.
Let me just bring up the responses to our last, I thought really maybe the most interesting poll question about how do you achieve this idea of economic sovereignty. All of the above seems to be a pretty popular option there, but certainly encouraging trade and supply chain diversification was one aspect that you guys all supported as well. Let's take a look at, in terms of the economic policy settings, the amount of stimulus that we've seen be rolled out by the government. And I address this next question perhaps to start with to you, John. We've seen Australia, like most other major economies, really the kitchen sink approach, right? Targeted, but ultimately very quickly scaled up to be able to deal with just the horror of levels of unemployment and bankruptcy and small businesses collapsing and even larger businesses collapsing that we've started already to see. Are you convinced that the current economic settings are appropriate? What more should be done? And how do we begin, or do we even have a conversation as to how you get out to the other side of this?
Look, I think you have to admire, I think the response has been very good, and particularly trying to keep people in employment. We know how difficult it is once people get out of employment to get them back in. And I think also to probably endorse Belinda's point before, I mean, the nice thing, what you have seen, I think, not only here but around the globe, is generally you have governments working with corporates in a much more collaborative way than we've ever seen. So I think that's really positive. And I go back to a point I made a bit earlier, that one of the challenges we've got is Reserve Bank doesn't have a lot of firepower here. So it really is, we are very reliant on government, and government going both hard and smart at this and really making a difference. So I think, what they've done, I think, has been appropriate. I think it is actually standing us in good stead. I think the challenge going forward will be how do they be smart in terms of policy. We go back to some of the same things. We had a lot of reform in policies in the 80s and early 90s, but probably haven't had a lot since. And so I think, as we come out, it's going to be really important we start to see, major reform in things like tax policy, in sort of infrastructure pricing and charging, in some of the things that we've talked a lot about, but probably haven't done enough of. And, a lot of the taxes we have now are actually hurting prosperity, whereas if we shift to things like more on GST, more on some of those taxes, we can actually improve prosperity and really help us as we come out the other side.
Mark, I wanted to get your views on pandemic preparedness, because I know in your business, it's been one of the hardest impacted in terms of just cancellations of major events, of corporate events, of essentially, anything requiring catering or food sort of services coming to a complete standstill. Do you think, in terms of the lessons learned on best and worst case handling of pandemic preparedness, what to you are things that corporations can take away from what we've just gone through and continue to go through? And do you think executives will be gun shy in this next period, given everything that they've gone through?
So look, in terms of, you're right, we've seen some parts of our business, very heavily impacted by this, but equally we've seen other parts like mining, for example, and healthcare that have actually seen quite an uptick. So I think it's not been even across the economy. I think in terms of pandemic preparedness, we're all going to come out of this differently. I think we're going to really have to rethink the consumer dynamic and rethink our businesses. We certainly are doing so, Heidi, as you'll imagine, and have done since this started for us in Wuhan in China over a couple of months ago. Your question on, how will business respond? I am nervous that we might take this as another reason to be anxious or reserved about Asia. And I think one of the issues for Australia, despite the fact that we have this huge opportunity at our doorstep, is that there is a certain degree of risk perception in investor communities, in funds managers. And I think it's compounded also by the fact that we have a reasonably low amount of Asia expertise, in our boards and our exec teams. I mean, AsiaLink did a fascinating study recently which assessed, really how adequately equipped business in Australia was to deal in Asia, and assessed Asia capability at 19% on boards, 14% on senior exec teams, and 10% on overall leadership teams. We have to jump shift that, because if you understand the region and you're comfortable in the region, you're less likely to see the risk, and you're probably better able to navigate successful business outcomes. So I think that's a very high priority for me, so that we don't miss this opportunity. I think it will make some people nervous, but I think we have to see through that. And perhaps the final point that I'd make is that, for businesses trying to navigate it, one of the ways that you reduce the risk is to really take the sort of playbook out of the really successful businesses. What do? They pick their place, so they don't address Asia overall. It's too big and too complex a market. They work out where they can be successful. They generally have feet on the ground. It's that transition from being an exporter mindset to, I'm actually going to compete on an ongoing basis in this business. It allows you to respond much quicker out of the back end of something like this. As I said before, we're back up to almost full operations. They have the Asia knowledge through their executive levels. And I'm a great fan on local leaders, because I think they are far more likely to be able to interpret your global strategies, tailor them locally, and build the sort of relationships that you need at a local level in Asia to be successful.
Before we head into the last part of the conversation, I actually want to bring up our third polling question, which is a simple one. Which country in the region presents the biggest opportunity for Aussie business? Is it India, Indonesia, China, Japan, or South Korea? In 2018, we had China coming in at 55%, India up next at 24%. And interestingly, by 2019, we had China really falling back to 31%, equal weight with Indonesia, and India climbing to 26%. Belinda, this idea of, I guess, executives, but also just the consumer, the student, the average person being risk averse, and how that changes when we get to the other side of this. I'm wondering what conversations you think we should be having about how much this changes our assumptions of the world, of the economy, of how, processes work. Because before this, there was a big sort of, narrative that it's too risky, for example, to transition to a green economy, to transition to making, these real progressive reforms on climate change. Well, if you tear up the playbook, if you throw out your assumptions and your forecasts, like so many countries and businesses have in the middle of all this, does that mean that dislocation gives us opportunity to be able to tackle some of the things in the too hard basket?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really impressed me, and I sort of feel I've almost been in the eye of the storm with, in terms of the businesses I've been involved with, like the university obviously has been heavily impacted, Qantas significantly impacted, but, it's been remarkable to see how well our management teams have responded to those and put in place crisis management teams, pandemic response teams, doing whatever it took just to actually deal with the problem as it came in, batten down the hatches, reduce costs as much as possible, cut capital expenditure projects, doing whatever it took. But I think we're all now starting to think about how do we use this as an opportunity going forward, because we're going to have to look at a different model of delivery in most of our businesses over the next few years, because we're not going to bounce back immediately. There are lots of opportunities for us. As I mentioned at the university, digitisation and having moved all of our students in terms of online learning, our students don't want to learn only in online, but there is opportunity to take the very best of that online learning experience and to use that back on campus and use some sort of blended model of delivery. So I think those are the sort of things we're looking at. And I think around, every industry that I'm involved with is saying, how do we make the very best of this crisis and come out of it stronger, leaner, more efficient, more effective? How do we work with government around tax reform, industrial relation reform, general cutting of red tape, regulations, but then how do we think more broadly around dealing with some of those major social and economic issues we face, such as climate change, such as geopolitical risk? How do we work together? How do we get the sector, the university sector, our researchers to work better with government and with business to deal with those issues? So I'm actually in the same camp as Mark and John. I'm relatively optimistic. I think it's going to be a hard road out, but I think if we don't take advantage of the opportunities, if we don't, work with the National COVID-19 Coordination Commission, if we don't work together to look at how do we do things better, we will have missed a great opportunity.
All right, before we leave things, and I'm aware that we are running short of time, I want to bring up just the results of that last poll in terms of which country provides Australia with most opportunities at the moment. You can still see that dominance by China, but certainly it wasn't that 50-50 weighing that we saw even just a couple of years ago. And in fact, Indonesia coming in second, India again. Pretty close there as well. Well, thank you so much to our panel for your time today, sharing your views. So much uncertainty. I think it's really important to get those views and have this discussion. Thank you to everyone in the audience who sent through questions as well. We only got through just a few of them, but we do have a final session ahead. More audience polling, more analysis of some of these big issues will be covered. I want to throw things back to Ed Johnson, our managing editor for Bloomberg News, Greg Earle, the editor of Asia Society's in-house publication Briefing Monthly, for the rest.